welcome to the Stoa. Today we have our friend Dave Snowden returning. Dave's a Welsh management consultant, and he focuses on the application of complexity science. And he developed the model that keeps on giving, the Cynefin framework. And he's the founder and chief scientific officer at Cognitive Edge. So Dave was here, I think a month or so ago, on a session about intuition. And as an aside, he started dunking on HR. And I think the term HR bullshit was mentioned either in the session or in the chat. And it kind of caught my attention because I used to work in HR. And let's just say, like, from firsthand experience, some of the stuff that Dave was talking about deeply resonated. So I reached out to Dave after the session, asked him if he was interested in having a session on HR bullshit. And he agreed. So I'm super excited about today's session. So yeah, we're here for about 60 minutes. I'll tag in Dave and he'll share his thoughts, I imagine, and then we'll pivot to Q&A. So if you have questions anytime, just put in the chat. I'll call on you, unmute yourself, and ask your question to Dave. If you don't want to be on YouTube, just indicate that and I'll read your question on your behalf. So that being said, Dave, welcome back to the Stoa.
Cool. I can unmute myself. Yeah, thank you, Peter. Always a pleasure to be here. Right. Okay. So, as per normal, I mean, one of the reasons I like to come here is there are interesting questions and the odd debate. It would be nice to see people as well. It's horrendous speaking to sort of effectively a screen, or worse still, yourself. So let me first of all give some of my own background in this. I left university with a degree in physics and philosophy, and then did 2 or 3 years work in a Christian charity, well, to be more accurate, a Christian Marxist group. I managed a Catholic Marxist takeover over a Protestant missionary society, and I'm still quite proud of that one. Yeah. And that renders you more or less unemployable. So I ended up in HR and training. And the reason I got the job, to be honest, is that there was this military guy who was in charge of it. And he discovered that I'd done some work in the Middle East. So I say I lived in Geneva and traveled around the world on that. And so he called me in for interview, I think because my CV was different from everybody else's. And at one point he turned around to me and said, okay, you've worked in the Middle East. What's the difference between a bribe and a gift? And I remember just roaring with laughter and saying, well, yes, I know it, but you know I can't explain it. And that got me the job, right? So along with the fact there were very few people who'd worked on 4 continents in their early 20s prepared to work for what I had to work for in the absence of a job. So that kind of like worked out. Now, in those days, HR actually was generally run by ex-military people. So we had 2,500 employees. We had the ex-major who ran the place, his deputy and me and the secretary. And we managed HR for the entire organization. Later on, it ended up with a department of 15 HR specialists. And I would argue that that's actually where things started to go wrong. People from military backgrounds kind of like understood the bureaucratic admin side of personnel, but they also understood the action orientation side of personnel, that you had to encourage people and get them to work differently. Yeah, so it was kind of like a late career route, and they weren't trying to rise the corporate ladder. For them, it was a retirement job, and they wanted to do a good job and get on with things. So that was kind of like one feature of it. And it also meant that HR was a function of line managers. So we were there to kind of like assist them, but not to do their work for them. I spent 2 years doing that, started to design computer systems. And then one day, I was very naive in those days. I thought the role of HR was to look after employees and to protect them from tyrannical managers. So we got a new financial director in, and I decided he was abusing his staff. So I went in to explain to him why he couldn't do that. I was from HR, et cetera, et cetera. Now you can imagine what happened. This is a brand new FD. yeah, shall we say, various expletives we use, I sort of left the office in a sort of dampened mood. And next day got summoned to meet financial director and HR director. Unfortunately, the HR director was grinning. And I was given a choice. I could either go and work for the financial director as his deputy, or I could be fired for insubordination. Which did I want? Yeah. And to be quite honest, it turned out he'd never had anybody who'd stood up to him before in his life. So he decided I must have something about me. And he was kind of like a wise guy. I'm going through some good examples of HR before I hit what happened when we joined IBM. So for example, one day, by this time I was running the treasury side, which in a survey company was quite interesting, because you had effectively, if we, BP would phone us up, or one of the big oil companies, and say, first person with a survey crew with all the instruments on the dockyard in Lagos gets a $50 million contract. So I actually had $10,000 in cash permanently in the safe to hand out to some 26-year-old engineer, so he could bribe his way through Nigerian customers to get the thing. It was that sort of work. Yeah? And one day, I caught the said engineers, right? This is one of my first encounters with engineers. I've had lots with software people earlier, but these were sort of survey guys. And I caught them effectively defrauding the company. They all put in expense claims for £40 taxi fares for a training course they'd been on. And what they forgot is I used to be HR and training. So I designed that training course. And I'd made sure it was in a hotel in the middle of the Lake District, so I could go climbing, on company expense. And there was only one train a day, and the hotel was opposite the station. So the chance that 25 electrical engineers all needed to get a taxi to walk across a village green kind of like seemed a little bit odd. So I went to Bob, who was the FD, and say, I've caught the bastards, mass trial will fire the lot of them. So I was young and David said, no. He said, they're far too expensive. He said, wait for the weekend. So those days, some of you are probably old enough to remember this, it took the entire weekend for the general ledger to run on the computers. And IT, had the highest divorce rate of any department in the company, because we all had to go in for the weekend and stay as long as it took doing very boring tasks. So that weekend we went in. We went down to the engineering shop, and he sort of sat on a stool with his pipe and said, hunt around and see what you can find. So went around, opened drawers, and found an entire drawer full of blank receipts. Lots and lots of receipt books. And I said, Bob, you're brilliant, right? This is obviously institutional, fraud, and the department manager is like, so we're going to fire everybody tomorrow, are we? And he said, no. He said, go and get one of those big metal trays from the marine yard. So I brought in this big metal tray. And he said, throw all the receipts on top of that. So I did. Then he came along and he tapped his pipe out onto the receipts. And we stayed there where they burnt into this smouldering black mess. Then he said, wait and see what happens. So on Monday, they all came in. And at this point, they knew that we knew that they knew that we knew. It was, expense claims plummeted to 20% of their previous rate. And after 3 months, he actually increased the per diem rates and allowed them to keep one item of company equipment after the end of each trip. And I said, why are you doing this? And he said, well, they've learned their lesson. And actually, that means we're not paying them enough if they go for fraud. Now, I learned a lot from Bob, all right? That was one of the ones I most remember. Actually, it's fed into sort of complexity thinking since. He didn't move into a rule-based environment. He changed the environment so people worked things out for themselves, and that worked for the benefit of the company. So he wasn't getting rigid about this. It was kind of like structured, it was maturity and all those sort of things. Now, obviously, there are some things which are definitive fraud, but expense fiddles are kind of like common in most organizations. Famous one we had in IBM was when, after IBM took us over, and now I'll start to build into some anecdotes and then talk about some new directions. So IBM took us over. By this time I was in a business management / strategy role. And we were actually floating the company. So on Friday, we thought next Wednesday we were floating the company. I had an acquisition budget to buy 3 companies across Europe. And then IBM landed at Heathrow Airport. And by Monday, we've been sold to IBM by the venture capitalists. It was, shall we say, an interesting weekend. Yeah. And the first thing they did was to charge us for coffee and ban alcohol. Now, we're a software development house, all right? The coffee alcohol cycle is critical to good software development. Yeah, nobody should be expected to talk to users without alcohol first. You then need coffee to sober up to write the code. And you need even more alcohol to deal with users who don't want what you can prove they asked for when you give it to them, but want something else instead. Either way, we got around that. But then it got worse. They banned us for buying food for staff. Classic big corporate environment. Yeah. And by now we'd realized that the only way to deal with IBM HR bureaucrats was a Socratic approach. Yeah, reason, logic, argument, evidence never worked with them. But Socratic approaches occasionally work, but you have to remember that kind of like the people of Athens got so pissed off with its effectiveness that they sort of forced Socrates to commit suicide. So one has to have that in background. So by then I'm C-level. So I went in to see HR and I said, look, this is a real problem for us. I said last night, and I waited for the occasion, I was on call out. So we always had one C-level executive on call out for a crisis. Yeah. And as you all know, the more you get promoted, the more you only meet angrier and angrier customers. It's always worth remembering that. Right? And so we had an emergency call out service, which ran on VAX clusters. And an upgrade on the VAX clusters had caused a massive system crash. So we weren't going to be, we had to be up at 9 o'clock in the morning. Otherwise, there were huge penalty clauses. Now, actually, the reason for that, as a sidebar, is that HR had decided to cut the training budget, and they decided that systems programmers could actually do everything they needed from the manual and didn't need to go on upgrade courses. And that was the reason we'd had the crash. They hadn't been on a course. They were frantically trying to read the manual and work the stuff out. Interestingly, when we challenged HR on that 2 weeks later, they said it wasn't their problem. They just had to reduce the training budget. The fact that it could cost us $10 million was irrelevant for them. That was a sort of silo mentality. But either way, in this case, you don't point that out. And I said, look, I got called out. I can only do 2 things. Yeah. One is I can keep the customer away from the systems programmers. Yeah, my job as an executive is to keep the customer happy, to phone them up constantly, to make them think we're doing something, and just get everybody off the back of the programmers because they know how to fix it. I just need to give them the space. And I said, the second thing I needed to do is to keep them awake. And the only way I know to do that is to buy them pizza and Coke. And there was this sort of horrified look at me, and I realized they might have got that wrong. So I said, I did mean Coca-Cola, at which point they relaxed a bit, but it did give us some ideas for future crises. Right? And I said, so what do I do? And they hummed and they hawed, and they weren't very happy. And they eventually said, okay, well, that's all right. If you get vice presidential approval in advance of the event, you can buy food for staff. Now, at this point, you breathe slowly and don't point out that if you actually knew it was going to happen in advance, you could probably stop it happening anyway. And I remember saying, okay, that's brilliant. We would never have thought of that. This is one of the benefits of joining IBM. At this point, we're realizing that irony and sarcasm are deadly weapons against HR people. And we used to switch irony on and off with HTML code in chat lines while we were having conference calls with them, which caused endless confusion, right? So I said, that happens. What happens on the very rare occasion where we don't get 2 days notice of a crisis? And then got very silent, never give them an answer. And they hummed and they hawed. And then they said yes in a way which means no. HR departments are really good at this. In fact, bureaucrats in general. So they said, okay, you can buy food for staff ad hoc if you need to, but you have to get country general manager approval for your expenses after the event. Okay? I'm a C-level bloody executive. I can't buy pizza and Coke, but never mind that. And anybody in IBM knows that country general manager approval means your expenses will disappear into the South Bank. They'll never be signed. if you complain about it, your name will appear on the wrong sorts of lists. You do not want to be on those lists at quarter end. Right? And so I gather, and I hasten to add that, of course, I never did this. This is just me reporting what other people I understand did in similar circumstances. The practice emerged of over-tipping London taxi drivers. Because if you over-tip a taxi driver, they give you a blank receipt. It's part of the unseen rule of the way the thing works. And then the responsible manager would buy pizza and Coke and fill out one of the blank taxi receipts and submit it for expenses, and kept a parallel set of books so they could prove what they'd really spent the money on if they were ever found. Yeah? And I gave this example at a Scrum conference in Berlin and also at a big conference in Dubai a year later. On each occasion, 2 to 3 people from IBM ran up to me, showed me wallets full of blank receipts and said, "We still do that. Did you invent it?" Yeah? Now, that is a classic example of what the Scots call canniness. Yeah, most human beings faced with stupidity will find a workaround rather than commit suicide by arguing against the process. If you over-constrain a system, yeah, then actually that's what happens. And to give another example, sorry, I did say last time that after 7 years of working for IBM, I had enough examples to keep me going for years. Yeah, the other thing which happened after IBM is that we got told that our salaries, the annual pay review, we didn't have annual pay reviews. We paid people when we needed to pay them, but now we're into an annual process and it's all run by a spreadsheet. So I am given the profile for my staff. Yeah, I'm not allowed to have a 100% high performing team. 60% have to be medium. You all know the way these things work, right? So I'm sat there and I actually have a high performing team. It's we're the most profitable business unit 5 years running. Now I should tell you why on that, because that's a side story. Yeah. So the reason was we were designing and building decision support systems. And this is the early days of decision support when it was run on mainframes and you charged people for MIPS, which meant an inefficient programmer earned more profit than an efficient programmer. Yeah, we got away with it in those days. And I went to Richard Atkins, who was then financial director of Thorn EMI. So I was designing a system as I'd done it for Guinness and for Maersk Groups and for Union International. And I said, I can do this 2 ways. If I do it the way you've specified it, it will cost you this much money. If I do it the way I think you should have specified, I can alter parameters and handle radical change when it comes to next year's round. But it will cost you another $30,000. And he said, no, don't need that, got the specification right. So I thought, to hell with this, and I wrote it the way I thought it should be written. Yeah. 1 year later, he came and said, okay, you were right, I was wrong. We've got to change it. And I said, well, same option. I can write it the way you've now specified it. He said, no, I've got it right this time. So we just changed some parameters, waited 2 months, asked him to test the system, charged him for a full rebuild. And we did that 3 years on the run for about 4 clients. And that was the reason I was the most profitable business unit. He then became financial director of data sciences. And he called me in one day and he said, I need to know 2 things. One is, why are McKinsey saying that I should invest in you with no hope of return in the next 5 years? And secondly, how the hell have you made all this profit? Because I can't see rhyme nor reason to it. So I told him how I'd made the profit and he looked at me with an appalled face, all right? He never blamed me for it. It was his own bloody fault. I gave him the option. And I remember saying, and the reason I'm in the McKinsey's thing is I've been on their website, I've worked out what theory they're working from, so I know how to answer the questions. So I end up in the top right-hand box of their matrix. At which point he removed me from business management and made me strategy director. So that was an interesting change, right? But anyway, come back to the point. I mean, I had to get around this. So what I did is I took on one of those projects you've always got in a systems integrator, which nobody wants because they're very low margin. They're going to take about a year and you've got a big team. So I took one of those, which meant I had a whole bunch of short-term contractors. So now I could pay them nothing and pay my team at the top. And I started to realize that the secret of survival in IBM was to game the system, yeah, to find ways to work the system so you could achieve results. Yeah. Another story on that, and then I want to go become a bit more positive. And sorry, I did say there were loads in IBM. One of the other things which happened is when IBM took us over, one of the first things I did was to fly around the world and meet other companies who'd been bought by IBM. And I remember going back to the board and saying, okay, guys, yeah, all this stuff they're telling you that they want us to maintain our independence and our brand, and they see us as having high value, is just bullshit. What they want is for us to stay independent for a year while they look at what we do, and then they'll cherry pick stuff and take it into their units. So I said, the only hope for survival is to demand full integration into IBM tomorrow. Yeah. And actually that was based on advice I had years ago from a good CEO. He said, whenever you're taken over, go out and have a wake and morning and take all your memorabilia out of the office and start again as if it was a new job. And that is actually really good advice. So I said that, and I said, the other thing you've all got to do, because I said, I've got a new job. I'm going around and meeting people in IBM. I've been given a role which said I could do whatever I wanted at a reasonable salary, provided I did interesting things. It was one of the nice things about IBM. They had those sort of roles. Yeah? I said, any of you are general managers, you've only got one choice. First of all, become IBM, because then they'll have to put you in charge of the units. If you wait a year, they'll find people to take over from you. And I said, secondly, employ somebody at D grade in IBM who's within 5 or 10 years of retirement. And they'll manage the IBM process for you. So I said, it will cost you $250,000 a year. But what it means is you have your strategic discussion, you agree what to do, then you call this guy in, explain what you've agreed to do, and he'll rewrite it in terms that the IBM bureaucracy will understand using their language. And actually, that was actually quite successful. Most of the people who are general managers in data sciences are still general managers. And actually, one of them is actually country general manager in the UK. So I may or may not get into trouble for telling these stories out of school, right? Now, it's not just HR, but HR tends to manifest this. I'd also make another point. HR is the one department in a firm which isn't subject to the glass ceiling. So if you want an argument as to how the environment shapes the person rather than the person shapes the environment, look at HR. Yeah, it's highly bureaucratic, highly autocratic. Yeah, and actually these days there aren't many men in it. Right, in terms of the way it works. And I think that's the old thing about nature deals the cards, but nurture plays them. Right? If you put people into a bureaucratic role, regardless of their origins, they're going to become highly bureaucratic because that's actually the survival mechanism. So I think there are things we can think about and do things differently, right? I'm going to do this for about 5-10 minutes and open it up. And I'll doubtless think of some more stories in terms of the way it works, right? So one of the great survival in IBM, the great skill was to be in the right informal network. And one of the things you found, if two IBMers come together, and I've noticed this even to today, if you meet somebody, they want to know who else you know in IBM. Because what they're working out is which informal networks you belong to. Because that determines whether you can be trusted or not. Yeah? I remember sitting at Bedfont Lakes once with the team, and we were a Maverick team. Yeah, and somebody came in. I said, "Oh, you haven't met Tony yet. Tony's one of Tony's one of the good guys. Yeah, worked with him for years. All right, that's coded." And 2 minutes later, another guy came in called Peter, and I said, "Oh, you guys don't know Peter. He's from management consultancy. It's really important we work with him constructively." At which point, everybody clammed up, because they know that's linguistic code for don't trust this bastard, he's out to get us. Yeah? Now, that was the reality of the way it worked. If you knew Philip, and Philip confirmed you knew him, people would trust you or wouldn't otherwise. And that links in with something I found since we published the EU Field Guide, where I've been interviewing lots of C-level executives. The one thing which worked for them most effectively in a crisis is their informal networks, not their formal systems. Okay. Now, the reason that works is that an informal network is a context-free information channel. Yeah, the information channel and network has arisen independently of specific content, whereas formal systems are context-specific information channels. They've been designed around a certain type of information flow. So you need both, right? This is kind of like the fungal roots that connect the trees. That's the metaphor for informal networks. And if you look at it, I was on a conference call the other day, and I pointed out there, which made me popular in Singapore and very unpopular in the UK, that the Singapore civil service informal networks all come from the fact that they do military service. So every male in Singapore, and now the females, does military service. So they create bonds when they come out of school, often before college, in the officers' messes or the sergeants' messes with people they've never met with before from multiple backgrounds, because Singapore is educationally a meritocracy, regardless of where you come from. And therefore, their informal networks are actually meritocratic and cross-silo. Whereas in the UK, the informal networks come from attending 1 or 2 elite private schools and a couple of elite universities, so they're highly perverse. So one of the methods we developed, which HR departments are starting to pick up on now, is a thing called entangled trios, which basically seeks to link and connect people from different roles who don't know each other across the silos. And entangled trios is designed so that within 6 to 9 months, everybody is within 2 phone calls of everybody else. Yeah. Now, if you have that type of network density, you don't need to worry about knowledge management. And the critical thing is you can also delegate into that network. Now, we're picking that up more generally. If I've talked about this to you guys before, I apologize, but if not, sort of shout at me. We're currently starting to experiment with a new organizational form within Cognitive Edge. We doubled in size during COVID. There's nothing like a good crisis to help a complexity software and consultancy business. And we also decided that and it was a mutual decision, our commercial consultants would leave the company and form their own independent groups. They've been with us 10 years, they wanted to do that. So we got a much younger workforce, which is also now highly specialist. So I brought in designers, more than consultants, because we need, a designer can produce something in a couple of days, a consultant struggles with for weeks. So we got more specialist. And the way we're organizing is to group people in groups of 3 or 5 based on role. And of course, the roles overlap between groups of 3 or 5. And each group has autonomy to make a decision around its subject area. Right? So what we're doing is distributing decision-making, but managing the coordination process. And one of the reasons we did this is the full horror of trying to deal with holacracy in one of our clients. And holacracy is a good example. I mean, I know Brian well, which is why I haven't attacked it in writing yet. And Brian's a classic software designer. He doesn't like people. Very few people in software like people very much. Yeah. So in order to avoid the need for human judgment, he's written an algorithm which is so bureaucratic, you can avoid any person contact or judgment whatsoever. And of course, it completely stifles innovation and it rewards bureaucrats. So that was part of the stimulus for this, right? Was holacracy won't work, but we need distributed structures. So if you look at what we're doing is we're creating a network structure with multiple overlaps between roles. So there are checks and balances, but creating autonomy within that group to make decisions. Yeah? And that's something we're now building and experimenting with. And it's also linked with natural numbers. You'll remember when Robin Dunbar was on this? Yeah, the sort of Dunbar numbers. And I'm still pleased that the 5 million is true, because I always thought it would be. So it's nice to know there's evidence for that. What we're doing is working with that groups of 5 or less. We'll go 3, 5, or 7, and ideally groups of 3 or 5, because there you can have high degrees of interaction. But there's always one trio will always have a common member with another trio, so that we get that communication channel and we can get micro correction. And the CEO function, which is still me, is only there for major crises. Right? If it's really needed. This is designed for lazy CEOs, and I'm definitely a very, very lazy CEO, in terms of the way it works. So that's kind of like one approach. The other big thing we're doing at the moment, which links with this, and I thought I'd try it out on you guys first. Don't know whether anybody has come across constructor theory in physics. Okay, this is one of the really interesting of physics. It comes from Deutscher and others at Cambridge University. And it's an attempt to look at physics from a whole systems point of view rather than atomistic point of view. So traditionally, physics has tried to break things down into smaller and smaller units. Yeah. My own view is that quarks was small enough. I can still get my mind around quarks, and I quite like quarks because they come in threes, right? But the idea is from that, we can then build predictive models. So we understand a system by understanding the component parts and their interactions. What constructor theory does is differently. It starts off by saying, and this is called a counterfactual, which isn't the best of terms, I don't think, yeah, because it has other meaning. But what they basically say is you start off by defining what isn't possible. Right? So the first and most fundamental thing is what can't happen. Yeah, you can't break the law, second law of thermodynamics. You can't break the law of gravity. So that determines it. And within that space, anything else is possible. But what you have to do is to create constructors which produce replicable outcomes. Yeah, it's actually, I'm really fascinated by this because it breaks the postmodernist nonsense. It doesn't mean that all outcomes are equally likely, because human beings are really good at creating constructors which create certainty. So at one extreme, one type of constructor, for example, is a machine. Yeah, a machine produces consistent results with the same outcome. Another constructor, and this actually, I'm quite proud of this because I did this 10 years before they produced constructor theory. And one of the things I was arguing back in 1998 is that there were two disastrous models in knowledge management. One was a Secchi model from the NACA. And I come back against the NACA twice, once in knowledge management and then in Scrum. And in both cases, he's created frameworks which have damaged things, in my view. The other was the DIKW pyramid, if you know that one, data, information, knowledge, wisdom, yeah, which I always thought was stupid. And I remember satirizing it once. We had a conference and there was a guy who decided that knowledge management was passé and he was going to found the discipline of wisdom management. And you should never irritate somebody like me in a conference, because I was trained in rhetoric. So I didn't have slides. Yeah. So I just drew a 5-level triangle, which went data, information, knowledge, wisdom, eschatological realization. There are advances to a philosophy degree and study in theology. And I gave a wonderful 20-minute talk about eschatological realization as a self-actualizing capability of autonomous communities. I was thoroughly enjoying myself, right? Half the audience was sort of rolling around on the floor in laughter, and the other half were getting really interested and taking notes, including the founding father of wisdom management, who for the next year kept trying to get me to come and talk about it as his knowledge board, all right, until somebody told him what I'd actually done to him. So I don't buy that as a method, all right? It's hierarchical, it's linear, right? So the thing I famously created in 1998 is I said, knowledge is, I didn't use the word constructor. I said shared knowledge is the way by which we consistently create information from data. So the focus on knowledge management should be creating shared knowledge at the right level of abstraction, because if we're all accountants, we understand account reports, but if one of us is an accountant and the others aren't, it's still data. Yeah? And that led me into Max Brasso and Max Brasso's work, and I worked with Max for years. In fact, I've got an unpublished paper with him, which I've got to get out, which fundamentally, I said, the purpose is knowledge exists within an acceptable range of abstraction. All right, so nobody can handle all levels of abstraction. That was one of the problems with communities of practice. You had deep experts who'd mastered the field with very young people with no knowledge, and therefore nobody would collaborate. The abstraction level was too wide, yeah, so you can hide it. Now that was actually, to my mind, and we've done that work since, seeing shared knowledge as a way of constructing shared information and organizing around shared knowledge bases and allowing the information to emerge was a key principle. So what we're now starting to play with, I published a provisional blog post on it recently. I've got a lot more to come out next week, And John Turner from North Texas, myself and Nigel Thurlow are currently writing a paper which, as soon as we got it into the publication process, we'll release, because we don't want people copying this too fast. But the basic principle is, all right, that the work we've done on constraint mapping, which I've talked about before here, is you map the constraints, and we're building kits for that. And then you identify which of the constraints can or cannot be changed over what time interval. So if in the time for change, you can't change the constraint, then it's a counterfactual and you shouldn't talk about that change. And then you can create constructor mechanisms which allow new types of coherence to emerge, but you don't pre-design those. That's kind of like the safe to fail mechanism. Now that has major implications for organizational design. Yeah, you start off by mapping the space, and remember, a lot of things, even though they're theoretically possible, are not politically acceptable. And that's something organizational design consultants keep forgetting. C-level executives are not evil people in the main. They just know the realities of their shareholders in the market and their survivability. It's one of the reasons McKinsey survives, because nobody gets fired for implementing a McKinsey's report. Yeah, I hired McKinsey's twice when I was strategy director, with absolutely no intention of paying any attention to them whatsoever. But it got the venture capitalists off my back for a year where I could sort things out for myself, right? Whereas if I'd employed some, highly effective one-man consultancy band and it had gone wrong, I'd have got fired. So that's actually part of what we call harsh pragmatism, right? Is you have to understand the reality of what can really be changed, which is the counterfactual. And then you have to create constructors to create repeatable effects. So for example, the entangled trios methods, what I just talked about in terms of informal networks, that's a constructor. Now that starts to change the way you think about things. Constraints, what are counterfactuals, what are not counterfactuals, what can be varied. Constructors with rapid monitoring so that good patterns can be reinforced and bad patterns can be disrupted. And that doesn't mean that you don't have bureaucracy, because we need bureaucracy about things like racism, right? So one more final story from IBM, right? Actually, two stories from IBM. You might as well realize my sister is even worse than me. She's a systems programmer. Whenever people think I'm being unreasonable, I introduce them to Mary, right? So she was a systems programmer, and two things happened to her, yeah? One is HR decided everybody should go on bonding ceremonies in outdoor environments, the sort of action learning type stuff. So they marched them all off into Snowdonia. Now, myself and my sister spent our entire childhood climbing those mountains. We know them backwards, and set them trust exercises, right? And nobody would listen to her because IT is the most misogynist department in any university, and the males don't regard the females. So there were some entertaining stories which came out of that. But the level of sexual abuse was incredible. She would come in the morning to nude pictures or Photoshops on her screen. Yeah, and nobody would do anything about that. And that was happening only 10 years ago, all right, in terms of the way it works. And there's similar problems, right? Misogyny is a real issue in IT, right? Look at the tests which were run only 3 years ago about blind scoring programmer capability before and after people knew whether the programmer was female or not. Okay. Now, all the rules in HR, which were meant to ban that, didn't work. And HR departments wouldn't take on a general manager who was encouraging misogyny. Right? Regardless of the rules, they found ways around it in terms of the system. So rules don't work unless your culture is in the right place and people have the right values. The other story is she summoned me up to go and meet with her team in Manchester once, and I should have realized the danger because I was cornered in the corner of a pub. They made me sit in the corner so I couldn't escape. And then she said, show them your laptop. So I showed them my laptop. I'm a C-level executive. I've got a super slim IBM ThinkPad, latest version, right? And all I do with it is email and some spreadsheets. And then they showed what they had, which is the stuff I and others had cast off like 4 years ago, and they're maintaining mission critical statements. Right. So either way, I had to buy several rounds of beer on that. And then they said, we've been told we're being outsourced. Right. So we've been asked to write down everything we do, and then that will go into the specification, which will go out into India, so somebody else can take over all of these legacy systems they were managing. And they said, we're thinking of actually sabotaging it. I said, you don't need to do that. Just do what you've been told to do. This is called a work to rule in trade union politics. They've asked you to write down everything you do, so do. Yeah. And one of the things they asked is which operating systems you use, yeah, and what application programs. So I answer that because it's the wrong question. They should be asking which versions of which operating systems over what length of time have you worked with. Yeah. And I said, what will happen is they'll outsource it. This is the name of the agency that IBM uses in the north of England for contractors. So leave en masse with your payoff, because that will be good. Set up a company, register with this bureau, and I guarantee you within 3 months, you'll get better paid work from IBM, because the systems will be falling over left, right, and center because nobody's got the experience. Yeah, and that actually came to pass because people had elected the experience element of where they were coming from. Okay, so we agreed last time when I agreed to do this, you wanted some stories. I've tried to add in some positive things as well as some negative things, right? And I've left 20 minutes, I think, or as long as you want. Yeah. So open to questions. If you're really I've just put up a blog post around Portuguese men of war as a metaphor for the new organization. So we can go on to that if you want.
Very cool. And are you okay to stay maybe 15, 20 minutes after the hour, David?
I'm cool.
Cool.
It's book club night, which males aren't allowed to go to. So I've got to stay out of things.
Nice. Yeah, your story resonated with.
Oh, and by the way, I do not mean Bejan. Yeah, I don't buy Bejan. He writes beautifully, but I think he's taking ideas from a very constrained field and trying to make them a universal. That's very different from constructor theory.
So I guess I'll warm you up with a question. Last time you were talking about Myers-Briggs and some of the like pseudoscience that's prevalent in the training aspect of human resources. Yeah. So I guess the question is twofold. Is perhaps you can speak more about the different types of things that are prevalent in HR industry and why that is.
Yeah, I mean, I've never understood why they do Myers-Briggs. I mean, it's been established as a pseudoscience in all literature for years. Nobody takes it seriously in psychology. And if you don't know the origins of it, it was originally devised by two really well-meaning women to try and understand educational needs. Yeah, and they didn't actually take Jung stuff. They took a book about Jung, and they famously wrote to Jung, and he more or less said, "You got it wrong," but that letter is hidden, right? And then Hay Consulting picked it up. And if you actually go back and read the literature on this, they agreed to compromise their ideas so that Hay could create the Myers-Briggs test and sell it. That's the origins. Yeah. It doesn't produce replicable results. It's easily gamed. But it only took off in the 80s. And I think that went with business process re-engineering. Now, I'll make a general point here. Too many people say they're against Taylorism when actually they're not remotely against Taylorism. They're actually against systems dynamics and all that followed from it in the 80s. Taylor actually believed in apprentice models of management. Right? There's the sort of highly rigid bureaucracies comes around with BPR and systems dynamics and learning organization. That's where all that comes from, right? So what that did is the engineering metaphor, HR departments started to see people as disposable items. Right? So I remember, I was in there now and HR said, you should assume that your career is 2 or 3 years and then we'll help you move on. Which is kind of like code speak for we see you as a disposable commodity. And I said, so what you're basically saying is that I rent my knowledge to you. And they said, well, yes. And I said, well, a rental arrangement is very different from a long-term purchase. Yeah. So I said, if you continue with this, you will only get what you absolutely need in context without any of the surrounding material. And that was a problem. But what Myers-Briggs did is, you're one of these, so we can slot you in. It was a way of classifying people on the factory shelf, right? There are some more interesting things. We're currently in some active conversations about this at the moment. So we're looking to start to define a typology of interaction types in teams rather than try and define individuals. Right? So I'd argue on a theoretical base that interactions matter more than things. Right? And who people are is their own bloody affair, and you've got no right to try and change it. And anybody who talks about mindsets seriously needs to go and do some reading, because there ain't any such thing. All right, it's an engineering metaphor. Yeah. So starting to actually look at how people interact, and we're about to release a free version of the software, which is a pocket Gemba system. One of the reasons we're doing that is to allow people to record anomalies and observations and ideas. We will make money. If their company wants to use it, they'll have to pay to combine the data. Yeah, it's kind of like freeware other than that. One of the reasons we're doing that is we also want to experiment in using people's day-to-day interactions to actually produce a typology of interaction types within teams against customers with effectiveness. All right, so the problem with Myers-Briggs, it's a taxonomy, not a typology. And I have used things like the original Belbin test, which I would use, because it doesn't say you are one of these. It says you've got these sort of orientations, and dependent on the context, they'll either become stronger or weaker. Yeah, so I've used Belbin and strength deployment inventory because they both assume you will change in context. Yeah, and therefore they have utility. So that's where I go on that. But I think there's some much more interesting work we can do, particularly when you realize that the whole industry, which is built off Freud and Jung, and yeah, both Freud and Jung, I know they're different. We're pretty cool in the 19th century, but we know so much bloody more now. Why are we still talking about subconscious and subconscious drivers when we know about extended consciousness? So Andy Clark's work in that sort of area, we're looking at that. So extended consciousness says your body, if your brain dies, you die. All right, your consciousness goes, but actually consciousness is a distributed function of the brain, the body, that's embodied knowledge, of specific actions that's enacted. And I buy Clark's concept that basically it's also extended into social interactions and common narratives. So your brain is effectively a focus point for a complex network of interactions, which is where consciousness comes from, which is why Freudian Jungian approaches are contraindicated, because they make an atomistic assumption. So what we're looking at is, can we start to measure that, and to measure that and produce what effectively will be a type of fitness landscape. I'm talking now about C charts rather than maps as well, because C charts contain higher levels of uncertainty. So can we create a C chart of typology types interacting within your environment, so that you can identify where there are weaknesses and strengths and where you need to supplement things or change things? And that's based work we've done a long time on cultural mapping, where you can bring in people from different culture, yeah, or to match cultures.
All right, awesome. We got some good questions in the chat. Peter Jones, if you can ask your question.
Thanks, Peter. Dave, good to see you again. I thought I'm familiar with IBM also having some interest in the personality Enneagram that they've used, from IBMers that I know that have used that.
Oh God!
But I didn't want to bring that up. Just
IBM loves things like that.
But they have not shied away from using these different models. This actually kind of ties into the question I have around uses of the DIKW, some of which are not that well understood or known. It's Akoff's framework. I think people don't realize there's a structural and a process component to it. It can be very helpful to think of each of those as a level of observation in which there is a flow of observations that is consistent within that flow. And this is also what I was tying back to. I don't know constructor physics theory. I like the simplicity of constructal flow. It's kind of self-obvious. but it's a process theory. And the notion of why processes sometimes often seem incomplete is that they are very difficult to measure. It's basically like the Heisenberg problem. It's easy to measure something that you capture, take a snapshot, so we can do that with a collection of a set of data in the DIKW, and you can measure each observation. But once these are converted to flows, they become fluid, and process theory isn't as measurable overall. And that's probably one of the weaknesses of Bayesian, is it never really got into predictability from those flows. But I think there's a way we can look at the DIKW as a way as the different transformations of those levels, because I use it for I teach it with data analysis. When I actually do data analysis, I call the levels of each level a different unit of analysis, if you will. But they are different transformations of the observations that are at a very, you have essentially in data, it often looks like you're capturing structures, thematizing, coding, nominalizing the data so that you can use it and create categories. But then once it becomes something like knowledge or wisdom, we're talking about flows almost entirely, and they aren't. And so having some traceability between them is helpful. So when I think about a process theory in respect to HR, constructive flow does sort of explain the workarounds in the flows in the everyday office gaming. Gaming the system is a type of least resistance flow of process, but you might have a better way of characterizing that. So I wonder if you could say something about the process relationships in these observations.
Let me start off with the IKW, all right? The second time I spent time with Akoff at Wharton, I challenged it, which rather shocked people, right? And he was open, right? Because I said, you basically taken that from the famous poem, right? It's, what is the wisdom which has been lost in, etc. And that's where he got it from, right? Now, Akoff, to my mind, is the transition between systems thinking and complexity thinking, right? Because he knew enough he's a very practical writer, right? And he was the guy who created mission statements, which is the other thing I challenged him on, because when he did it, it was highly original and made a lot of sense, but now it's an industry, right? And instead of being something novel, which created a sense of direction, it's now become a weans of manufacturing platitudes with expensive consultancy exercises. And being as they've got tired on that, they're now creating purpose statements, which are no different. Yeah. If anybody wants it, we have an offering, which is destroy your purpose statement for you, which it would cost you a good meal for me and the group of people I get together. And we find out all the ways your purpose statement can be misaligned. All right. I did it for one of the big oil companies lately, and they're still reeling from what we came up with. All right. So I actually think Akoff is wrong on DIKW. And I think we should stop talking about wisdom management. And I think the problem with that is you create, and I would say this is to my mind a general problem with a lot of people in cybernetics, is they like to create esoteric language which gives them too much power. Yeah? I want language which an executive can understand on first insight. That's how we also created the Cynefin. So to say if you have shared knowledge, you get consistent information, they can get that. Yeah. Starting to say, information is knowledge, I don't think that works, all right? So I would argue against it on theoretical grounds, but also on pragmatic grounds. And we had about 3 or 4 hours on that with Mac and Max and people, so we all thoroughly enjoyed it, right? So there's a difference on that. On the process stuff, I think the problem you've got is that the original work he did was in a very specific area, and what could have been a useful metaphor is now held to be a universal. Okay? So I think there are things that we can extract from that which have value, but it's wrong to say everything is flow dynamics. And it's wrong to say that everything is flow in the sense of his original research, because human beings and human systems don't work that way, right? So human systems are not linear, and everything he produces is a linear framing, right? So it doesn't handle non-linear work very well, but he's got a huge fan club, right? And one of these days we'll have the debate. So I wouldn't go down that. And I had this debate with Alicia Gerardo the other day. We're falling out over this, which we don't often fall out of stuff. I've said constructor theory was not derivative of this. It comes from a completely different base. They're both in physics, but at very different levels of physics. You know, he's in sort of thermodynamics and they're in quantum mechanics. Now, anybody who thinks that people from those two backgrounds have much in common hasn't worked in a physics department, right? So they're coming from quantum mechanics and the sort of reconciliation with general relativity theory. And what's interesting is constructor theory potentially provides that. And they're still working on it. So I think it's different, all right? And again, I wouldn't go with the flow stuff except within its original constraints. So in Cynefin terms, I buy it in ordered systems, but not in complex or chaotic. I think you have to have different framing then.
Yeah, I agree. Now, the point I wanted to really raise was that even with respect to DIKW, we're looking at it is, and I don't want to use the word mindset, but there is a completely different way of making sense of observations. I mean, as you would do a sense maker too, as you've observed, you have to retrain people to, if they're speaking in terms of stories, you're capturing process events, but they get translated into codified statements, and people who haven't thought to connect, to look at kind of the life cycle of continuity, you know, that these are often just so stories that are expressed as narratives that may capture a very extensive flow, and we don't have ways of, I mean, maybe even, you know, and I've looked for constructal theory to grow, and it really hasn't. So, I mean, I look at the fact that it hasn't been picked up on by other disciplines. It isn't co-cited very well, that it's either obscure or it isn't explanatory, or it's both. But it also gets to what I think, that we don't have good ways of describing these types of complex flows.
I think there's more scope in fitness landscapes where, I mean, I've been chatting about this with Stu and others as well. And one of the reasons I'm interested in charts is starting to use fitness landscapes the way that a mariner uses ocean charts. So if you start to think about it like that, granite cliffs are stable, whereas sandbanks change constantly. Yeah, and you have to be able to read underneath things from surface aspects and things like that. So it's a three-dimensional framing. So that's where we're going with SenseMaker at the moment, is new forms of representation. Yeah, and what we've actually found is SenseMaker doesn't work with narratives, it works with micro-narratives, observations. And we're just about to release, which I'm really excited about, is semiotic signification. So instead of using words to signify something, you use symbols or pictures, which is another level of abstraction. And so the idea from that is, and this comes back to this levels of abstraction, human beings work best at an optimal level of abstraction. And the problem with engineering approaches is engineering works well at a low level of abstraction, but not at a high level of abstraction. All right, and that's where you need sort of different tools and techniques.
Awesome. Thanks, Peter. Lorraine, you had a question.
Yeah, and I'm like jumping out of my seat at the comment about engineers and levels of abstraction, because I also work as a designer, and I'm actually a former student of Peter Jones. So I am pleased to be able to ask you a question about that acceptable level of abstraction. Sorry, while my dog is crying. One of the things that I come up against often with groups of people in kind of working in design is that shifting that kind of acceptable level of abstraction seems to be limited. I feel like people, and maybe I'm wrong in my kind of way that I'm understanding the term level of abstraction, but it feels like something that often we call like, oh, they're not creative, or like they're not able to kind of have an imagination. But I'm actually wondering if that kind of level of the acceptable is set by kind of the kind of dominant, you know, hegemony that is there just in the room, usually if you're working with a bunch of people, or is it set kind of by the constraints that you're working in as a consultant and who's paying for that? Or is it just something that can't be influenced? Like it just exists? Because I'm curious if you could stretch it, is that actually learning?
I think there are different levels and different types. So at the simplest level, abstraction is the use of the same technical language. Yeah. So I was having a conversation with my daughter earlier, right? And she did her thesis on Deleuze's assemblage theory. So we can have a very rapid conversation, yeah, because she also disagrees with my liking of Delander's reinterpretation of Deleuze. So we know the disagreements, we know the language, the conversation is fast. If somebody came in without knowledge of Deleuze, we'd have to drop the level of abstraction. We probably couldn't have the same conversation, it would take a lot longer. Yeah? So that's one level. And the anti-intellectualism in the UK and the US is a real problem here, by the way. Yeah, I mean, I remember doing a thing in Singapore with the armed services, and I used some words they didn't understand, so they asked me to explain them, and I did. And then 2 days later, I was at a British defence thing it was in one of the clubs in Pall Mall, and the servants in those clubs know I'm working class the minute I walk through the doors, so they start to put you in your place, right? And I did a similar lecture, and I was introduced by the guy who said he understood some of the words in isolation, but not in combination. So I was being put down. And I remember saying, I've just been in Singapore, and they politely asked about things they didn't understand rather than trying to pretend it wasn't important. And the guy was fuming like 4 hours later, but that worries me, right? But abstraction can then change. So we just produced a new method of creating the Kinevian framework, which is called 3 points. And we're using that with exemplar sets. So one of the exemplar sets we've created is actually film scenes. And I'm creating another one on childhood books, because those are common levels of abstraction. So anybody who grew up in my generation, somebody mentioned the Just So stories. If I say, you know, kind of like you're going to go to the Great Green Sea and Popo River, then they understand exactly what I'm saying. Yeah, and it would take me hours to explain it to somebody who hadn't read Kipling, right? So we can use key phrases, yeah, from books that are common understanding. And there's that wonderful period in English children's literature in the 1920s. I mean, the 1920s is up there with Shakespeare's time, and you've got Anthony Powell as well with Dance to the Music of Time. The English is wonderful. So you've got Wind in the Willows, you've got Secret Garden, you've got Winnie the Pooh, yeah. You've got Tolkien, right? And they don't compromise their language for their readers, but they weave the language together in such a way that you understand what it means. Yeah. And I think that's why I can't stand Enid Blyton and I can't stand Roald Dahl, because they dumb the language down. Yeah. And I think that's the problem. So, and we're also now starting to experiment with art. So you can use art as a level of abstraction. And remember, that came first. So abstraction in humans is actually really interesting in terms of the way that you can create common meaning and understanding. And metaphor is a form of abstraction. And metaphor is still really powerful in getting people to understand new ideas. The other thing which is also important is ritual. I'm reading a really good book at the moment by a Korean philosopher on the way in which we've lost rituals in society. And rituals create common levels of abstraction and meaning. Yeah, and so either way, expect some stuff on that coming downstream. Yeah. And famous 5 is Dyer, all right? I think comic strip did the best ever satire on that. Anybody seen comic strip satire on the famous 5? Okay, watch it, all right? And Enid Blyton is deeply racist. Deeply, deeply racist. Yeah.
And Byung-Chul Han is the philosopher. He's really good. The Disappearance of Rituals is the book.
Yeah, I love that. But it's interesting as well. If you want Winnie the Pooh as an example, all right? So I grew up with Winnie the Pooh. I can still recite whole sections of it from memory, right? It was part of the conversation in the family, right? You know, heffalumps, and, you know, in our family, we still call wine honeypots with all the references to Pooh that come from that, all right? So it's coded language, right? And then you see what Disney did with it, right? And what Disney did with Winnie the Pooh was truly, utterly, totally appalling. because they destroyed all the richness by reducing complex archetypes into a set of trivial stereotypes. Okay? And that's one of the worries you've got in terms of the way kids get brought up, right? In terms of what they read and what they see and how they see it. Harry Potter kind of like got it back again. Yeah, the language, although if you know Jennings and Derbyshire, and I grew up with Jennings and Derbyshire, you know where she got the ideas from. But it's still, you know, kids would read stuff. There was language in there, they didn't, concepts like Horrocks, which were brilliant, right? Which got them to think differently. And, you know, we do that. One of the things we do in Cognitive Edge, just to tell you, is everybody, when they join, has to have done the Harry Potter test, because we want to know which house they're in. And we're mainly Ravenclaws. We got one Slytherin, all right, who is really upset that she was a Slytherin, but is now releasing her inner snake, all right? So we're mainly Ravenclaws and Hufflepuffs. And what we're doing is to make it a joke. It's quite deliberate. And that's the problem with the Enneagram. Okay, so you got 9 types and you do a test and it tells you, that's nonsense, all right? That is not anything to do with human cognition whatsoever. It's a 19th century concept. It's a phrenology approach. And at the time, it was revolutionary and interesting. And then people added spiritual significance into it to try and get it to survive. All right. And we can do better.
Did you have any follow-up, Lorraine, or any thoughts you'd like to share?
I mean, I could listen to Dave Snowden talk all day, and I'm just really grateful. And thank you for answering my question.
Please tell my wife and daughter that. Yeah. They have a very different view. All right.
Evan, you're up.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm wondering, Dave, about your take on the whole moral mazes phenomenon. So I assume you're familiar with the term in the book. It's a really depressing book, and I'm wondering, so if you think that all large organizations are going to tend towards having this sort of moral maze nature, or if you have anything to say on that matter about like how to do things that require large group coordination without tending towards being a moral maze.
Yeah, and we're playing around with ideas on that, but I do think, I mean, I think this is where I started playing with Dunbar, with Robin Dunbar's stuff, all right? That people get this wrong. So, you know, the famous case of Gore, who decided he would, every business unit, when it hit 150, he would create a new business unit. I actually buy that, but he should have used 100, not 150. Because you should kind of like assume people have private lives, and some of the cognitive load needs to go for that, all right? But the idea, and that's what we're trying to do with the trios, all right? And we build that to trio groups. In fact, I'll be writing more about this tomorrow. That's where I'm using the Portuguese man of war, because the Portuguese man of war is not a hybrid, it's a colony of independent animals. Yeah. And it's interesting, the group it's a part of, their coherence either comes by tissue connection or by exoskeleton. So it's actually quite a good metaphor. So I think what we're talking about is defining smaller units where people can have coherent understanding, and then defining overlaps in interactions. And that's where things like the informal networks come in. But the ability to think about human beings really evolved for extended families and tribes. So clans and tribes, yeah. And hordes are a sort of occasional feature in response to threat. Now, if you look at big companies, and I've worked in a few or worked for a few, actually, if you look at them, they're a series of tribes and clans, you know, which play games at being a unified whole, right? The reality is different. So to say, I'll be writing more about this tomorrow. I'm still playing with some of the ideas. And the size of the unit varies based on context. So under threat, you can have a much bigger unit than when there isn't threat. Right? It's like in Britain that you get, well, don't get me onto our Prime Minister's inherent racism and English nationalism. I've decided I'm no longer British. I'm definitely Welsh and European, right? I don't want to be associated with English nationalism, right? But fundamentally, right, one of the problems with that whole approach is the attempt to create a unity which doesn't exist, right? It's to try and create a sort of false identity in terms of the way we think about things, right? The reality is, and this is what I've talked about here before, is what we want is coherent heterogeneity, not homogeneity. Homogeneity is what populists want and dictators want. And that's why I've always opposed mission statements and purpose statements and value statements, but slightly tongue-in-cheek, because I know they'll never work anyway. Right? Because all you're doing is making the language of power explicit so people can game it. You know, as any anthropologist will tell you, if you have to write your values down, you just lost them. Yeah, if you have to codify your purpose, then by definition, you're purposeless. Yeah. And I think that's where we need to start to go. We need to, and this is where we're starting now to talk about three things: agency, affordance, and assemblage. Right? So you need to work out, so the affordances are actually a type of counterfactual. Yeah. The assemblage is also counterfactual, but it's something which can be changed, but with difficulty. And agency is actually more manageable. So what do you give agency to is probably the most important question, rather than who do you give authority to?
Any follow-up, Evan?
No, I'll let somebody else ask a question. Thanks.
Let's see if we can squeeze in one more question. There's a few people who want me to read their question on their behalf, so I'll scroll up and find them. Someone was asking, maybe I can just do recall. Someone was asking about sort of ideologies, toxic ideologies that find their way into human resources. Perhaps if you have any thoughts on that, you can speak on it.
I mean, ideologies are ideologies. You can't get away with them. I mean, all God's people love anology, right? So you can't escape it, right? The issue is, when is it dangerous and when it isn't? That's the coherent heterogeneity thing, right? So can we be different in one context, but the same in another context? Yeah. Now, if you use populist ideology as a constraint, you've got a problem. And I mean, I was saying to the other day, everybody should watch Cabaret at least once a year, if you know the movie. Okay, watch the movie, right? The movie is actually better than Isherwood's book, because the movie switches the sexes and it works better. Yeah. But that is the most devastating explanation of how Nazi Germany came about. And there are two defining scenes in it. One is where they're satirizing Nazis on the stage of the Kit Kat Club, whereas outside a Jewish manager is being beaten to pulp by the Nazis. Yeah, and remember, the intellectuals retreated into scorn of the populists, but that will happen. But the really scary one is where our hero and heroine, having discovered that they both slept with a count, who's a representative of the Junker class, right? And in the conversation the night before, it was the Junker class model. We'll support Hitler because he'll get rid of the communists, then we'll deal with Hitler afterwards. That was how Hitler came to power, if you don't know it, right? He was supported by the Junker class against the... So they come to this small Bavarian village, all right? If anybody's seen Cabaret, you know the scene I'm talking about. And they sit down, and then this young stormtrooper stands up, you know, perfect, blonde, blue eyes, Aryan, yeah, and starts to sing, right? And it's the most terrifying scene in film cinematography, as they show the faces and the hatred, yeah? And as they walk away, they turn around and say, you really think you can control that? Yeah? And I think that's what we're facing. I mean, the US scares the living daylights out of me, because I think the midterms are going to go Republican. All right. And then, you know, forget global warming. We should start to about global superheating. Yeah. Yeah. In the face of the evidence. And you've got Brazil, you've got Britain. I mean, people are voting for Boris, who's basically lying through their teeth. Yeah. And is playing the populist argument. He's basically playing, you know, stir up English nationalism and racism, and then try and pretend he hasn't later. Yeah. There was actually a Islam MP who stood up and asked a question in Parliament in perfectly reasonable tone, and then just got the standard line about you're being hysterical and all. I tweeted that this morning. It's worth looking at for just how bad it is, right? So I think the danger with ideology is it becomes corrupt too quickly. And it comes back to this point about being simple. Yeah, the problem the left has always had, sorry, I'm still a frustrated Catholic Marxist or Catholic socialist. The problem the left has always had is it splits on minor points of doctrine. And it doesn't make things simple. All right, whereas populists can make things simple. And another story here, right? So I like stories because they make the point. So I was 11 years old, all right? This is 1964. And I won the primary school mock election for the Labour Party, which was a good job because if I hadn't, my mother would have killed me because she was Labour Party organizer, right? So at 11 years old, part of my job is to ride on my bike, taking poll returns from the polling station back to headquarters so we can go and knock people up and get them out to vote. Some things haven't changed in decades, right? And there was a woman in the Labour Party in Flintshire called Mrs. E.M.C. Davis, JP. And you never called it anything else but Mrs. E.M.C. Davis until you really got to know her where you could call her EMC. And she was a scary woman, all right? She sat for a major working class seat. She was a magistrate, so she sent most of the people who voted for her to prison on a regular basis. But they still voted for her because she looked after their wives and families where they were in prison, and they always reckoned she was fair about it. Yeah. And so she decided that I was obviously going to be a politician, so I needed to be talked to. So she told my mother she was taking me out for tea. And I wondered why my mother was nervous. And later on, when I read Dune and read about Gomjab, as I realized what was going on, right? If you don't get that, you'll have to read the book because that's important. And I remember she sat down and she said, you need to understand something. The reason they vote for us is because we care about them and we look after them. They don't believe in our politics. The day you make the mistake of thinking they agree with you politically is the day you will lose. And that's what happened to the Democrats in the States and to the Labour Party. They started to make it an ideological issue. They didn't make it an empathy and localized care issue. And what they did brilliantly, all right, in Georgia is to refocus it in that level. And that made a difference. And the work we're doing at the moment, which is actually active at the moment, the Peace and Reconciliation Project, which is where we're looking at micro narratives in red and blue communities and getting people to work together on projects which they see meaningful. And that's part of a massive switch, which we're focusing on, is all of North America and Northern Europe thinks the way you solve a problem is to talk about it and then decide what to do. Anybody who's worked in indigenous communities knows that's nonsense. You do things about it and then you talk about it. So that's what we're trying to orientate, is we need to start to create things that people can do together they find meaningful, which give them the space to have the difficult conversations at their own time without facilitation, yeah, or intervention. And again, that's me having another tack on Jungian coaching techniques, which I think are now quite dangerous. I thought I'd be really controversial in this community.
Yeah, we got to set you up with a Jungian here to debate. So we'll close up here. Dave, any closing thoughts you'd like to leave us with?
No, it's always fun to talk with you guys. Yeah.
We'd love to have you back, perhaps in conversation with some other people. If people are requesting a Dave Snowden debate with anyone, it seems like, so perhaps I will circle back and find you an interlocutor. But that being said, Dave, thanks so much for coming.
That's the age of 11 to 25, so I'm really happy with you both.
Cool. And the next session is tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern time, how the culture war creates integral consciousness with Jeff Salzman. You can RSP on thestoa.ca. So that being said, Dave, everyone, thanks so much for coming out today.
Pleasure.